Ma'am, you can't stand here. Move along before I call security.
I'm just waiting for my driver. There's no need for hostility.
Don't tell me how to do my job. People like you always...
Calmly wiping her cheek. You just made the biggest mistake of your life.
Oh yeah? And who are you supposed to be?
Pulls out ID. Alicia Monroe, CEO of Monroe Technologies. You just hit one of your mall's biggest investors.
Storytelling, Chapter 1, The Incident. The morning sun stretched over the city, painting the skyline in amber and gold. It was an ordinary weekday, and the mall was already alive with the hum of footsteps and murmured conversations. Security guards exchanged glances at the entrances. Store attendants arranged their displays, and the scent of coffee drifted through the polished corridors. It was a place that thrived on order. Every movement, every sound, perfectly curated to serve the illusion of calm consumer bliss. But not every smile in that place was genuine. Beneath the surface of politeness, there were glances that lingered too long, whispers that carried judgment, and smiles that curled with hidden contempt, especially when the faces that walked through those shining glass doors didn't fit the image some believed belonged there. That morning, a woman walked in, confident, poised, elegant. Her presence was quiet but commanding. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, with subtle jewelry and a designer handbag, she exuded the kind of grace that spoke of experience, of leadership, of power. Her name was Alicia Monroe. Few would have recognized her immediately, though many had read about her. She was the CEO of a rapidly rising tech conglomerate that had recently made headlines for its innovative expansion, a woman whose intellect had disrupted an entire industry. But in this mall, she was just another shopper. She had come for something simple, a gift for her niece's birthday, a quiet morning to pick up a small token before heading to a lunch meeting across town. She walked with purpose, glancing through window displays, unaware that her mere presence had caught the eyes of those who measured worth differently. The mall manager, Tom Sanders, prided himself on his authority. He was a man who liked control, the kind that made him feel taller than his own reflection. Years in management had made him believe he could read people at a glance, though what he really read was his own prejudice. When he saw Alicia, his gaze narrowed. Something about her composure, her confidence, her elegance unsettled him. He didn't see success, he saw challenge. Alicia entered a luxury boutique to browse. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The store clerks whispered behind the counter. One pretended to rearrange shelves while keeping her eyes fixed on Alicia. The silence grew thick, coated with suspicion. Alicia noticed, but she didn't react. She'd been here before. Not this exact place, but this feeling, the quiet disbelief that she belonged. It was a scene she'd learned to navigate with grace, though it still stung in ways she would never admit aloud. After a few minutes, she picked out a fine leather wallet and approached the counter. But before she could pay, one of the store clerks excused herself and slipped out of the boutique. Moments later, Tom Sanders appeared, his voice sharp, his stride brisk. He stopped right behind her. "Ma'am," he said, but his tone was not polite. It was the tone of accusation disguised as professionalism. Alicia turned slightly, surprised by his sudden presence. He continued, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. He asked to see her bag. He claimed there had been reports of theft, that she matched the description. There were murmurs from nearby shoppers, heads turned. Alicia tried to maintain her composure, her heartbeat steady. She explained calmly that she was a paying customer, that there must be a misunderstanding. But Tom didn't hear her words. He saw only what his assumptions told him to see. He reached out suddenly, grabbing her arm as she tried to leave. The gesture was rough, invasive, humiliating. The sound echoed, a slap. It was sharp, quick, almost unreal in its violence. It came from a place of defense, but dominance. The kind of slap that says, "You don't belong here."
The boutique froze. Time seemed to collapse. The sound rang in the air long after his hand dropped. Alicia stood still, her face calm, but her eyes aflame with a quiet fury that no words could contain. The clerks gasped. A small crowd formed at the doorway. Someone whispered, "He hit her." Tom's face flushed, not with guilt, but with that strange mixture of pride and fear. The pride of authority misused and the fear of being exposed for it. He mumbled something about keeping order, trying to justify what could never be justified. Alicia said nothing. She didn't shout, didn't cry. She simply fixed her gaze on him, a gaze so calm it was terrifying. Then she picked up her purse, adjusted her jacket, and walked out. The silence that followed her was heavy, suffocating. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Security guards looked at each other, uncertain. The clerks avoided eye contact. The whispers began again, louder this time, carried by disbelief and discomfort. Some took out their phones, others pretended not to notice. But deep down, everyone knew what they had witnessed was wrong. Outside the store, Alicia paused. She didn't tremble, she didn't break. She simply took a long breath, straightened her shoulders, and kept walking. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step echoing like a promise. She left the mall without another word. But the story was far from over. That afternoon, Tom Sanders sat in his office, irritated and restless. There was a strange tension in the air, something he couldn't quite place. The mall's corporate line had been buzzing all day. Security had filed an incident report. There were whispers that the woman he'd confronted wasn't who he thought she was. Hours later, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the corporate number, the parent company that owned the mall and dozens of others like it across the country. When he answered, the voice on the other end was firm, professional, and chillingly calm. They informed him that a formal investigation had begun. The woman involved was not just a shopper. She was a key partner in a pending acquisition deal that could redefine the company's entire future. Tom froze. The words blurred. A name was spoken. Alicia Monroe, the CEO of Monroe Technologies, a corporation known for innovation, wealth, and influence. A company that was, as of next week, set to finalize a strategic partnership with the mall's parent company. Suddenly, everything he thought he knew shattered beneath him. The hierarchy he'd built his arrogance upon crumbled beneath him. The woman he'd humiliated, the one he'd laid his hands on, was not someone the world ignored. She was someone the world listened to. But Alicia hadn't made any public move yet. She hadn't gone to the police, hadn't gone to the media. Not yet. And that silence was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. Because silence, her silence, meant she was thinking, planning, deciding how to respond. And when a woman like her decided to respond, things never stayed the same. The mall continued its day, oblivious on the surface. But beneath that calm, a storm was gathering, one that would not stop until every mask of civility was torn away and every person involved learned what true power looked like. Alicia's steps echoed out of the mall doors and into the parking lot. The sunlight hit her face again, steady and unflinching. She looked at her reflection in the glass, the faint red mark on her cheek, fading already, but leaving something far deeper behind. A memory. A line drawn. By the time she got into her car, she knew one thing for certain.
Chapter 2. The Calm Before the Storm. The night after the incident was strangely quiet. The city outside Alicia's window moved as it always did. Cars sliding through the wet streets, neon lights humming against the rain. Yet in her penthouse suite overlooking the skyline, the silence felt like a weight pressing down. She sat by the glass wall, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her, the dim city lights reflecting against her eyes. The mark on her cheek had faded, but the memory of that slap remained. It wasn't about pain. It was about violation. About years of quiet endurance condensed into one humiliating moment. Alicia had built a life beyond such small-minded cruelty. Yet that single act had stripped away the illusion that success could ever shield her completely. For most of her life, she had believed in restraint, in letting dignity speak louder than anger. But as the city stretched before her, she understood something deeper. Silence could be misread as submission, and this time she wouldn't let that happen. Down below, the mall continued to function as if nothing had occurred. Its polished floors reflected smiles and laughter, its loudspeakers hummed soft background music. But behind the scenes, the tension had begun to grow. The corporate office had received the report, and the incident had already circulated through private networks. Employees whispered about the woman in gray. Security footage had been reviewed. Emails had been exchanged. Calls had been made. Tom Sanders arrived at work the next morning pretending nothing had changed. He greeted the same clerks with forced cheerfulness, straightened his tie, and tried to convince himself the world had moved on. But every glance that lingered too long made him uneasy. The staff no longer looked at him with respect. They looked at him with fear, with disbelief, with quiet judgment. By mid-noon, his phone buzzed with a message from headquarters. "Expect corporate visitors this afternoon. Prepare your office." His throat tightened. At that very moment, Alicia was in her own office, the top floor of a sleek glass tower downtown. Her company's name gleamed across the building in silver. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, filled with the soft hum of progress. Her assistant briefed her on the morning's meetings, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Alicia nodded mechanically, handling her business with the same precision as always. But deep down, she was waiting for the right moment to move. She had not posted about the incident, not a word on social media, not a whisper to the press. She didn't need to. Her silence had power because of who she was. And those who knew her reputation knew that when she went quiet, something was coming. By mid-afternoon, Tom stood in his office, pacing. Sweat prickled his neck as two men from corporate arrived, their suits immaculate, their expressions unreadable. They informed him that the company had initiated a formal review of his conduct, effective immediately. His protests spilled out clumsily, claims of misunderstanding, denials wrapped in excuses. But none of it mattered. The footage spoke for itself. Every movement, every gesture, captured clearly by the boutique's cameras. Tom's words tripped over each other as he tried to explain, but the corporate representatives remained still, detached. One of them mentioned that Miss Monroe's office had been in contact, that there would be further discussions about the company's partnership, that his actions might have jeopardized more than his own career. That name again, Monroe. It echoed in his mind like a verdict. That evening, Alicia received a call. Not from Tom,
but from one of the executives overseeing the mall's operations. They spoke cautiously, formally, apologizing profusely. They begged for a meeting, offered statements, explanations, even settlements. Alicia listened, saying almost nothing. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and measured. She agreed to meet, not as a victim, but as a decision-maker.
When the call ended, she sat back, letting the quiet envelop her once more. Her reflection in the glass was steady. This was not revenge she wanted. It was accountability, a lesson in respect, a demonstration that power did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it came wrapped in silence, unfolding at the perfect moment. The following morning, news began to trickle through certain business circles. Discreet messages exchanged between executives, brief mentions in private emails, whispers that something serious had happened between Monroe Technologies and the Mall Corporation. Investors grew restless. A pending deal that was once certain now hung by a thread. And through it all, Alicia remained silent. At the mall, the staff had begun to sense that something bigger was unfolding. The clerks avoided eye contact with Tom, who now moved like a man haunted. Each customer who walked through the doors felt like a reminder. Each security guard's glance carried unspoken accusation. The very place that had once fed his ego now felt like a prison. But Alicia was not done watching. She spent the next few days quietly gathering information, statements, footage, records, not for legal drama, but for precision. She wanted truth, not vengeance. Her team at Monroe Technologies handled it discreetly, verifying every fact, documenting every second of the incident. The company's PR department prepared for all outcomes, but awaited her word to act. She still hadn't spoken publicly. And the world's silence before a storm is always the loudest. Days later, Tom was summoned again, this time to a conference call that included board members and legal advisors. As he sat before the camera, his reflection looked pale and defeated. The board questioned him with the cold detachment of people protecting their assets. They knew what he had done was indefensible, and they feared the fallout. He was suspended indefinitely, pending the company's final decision. That evening, Alicia drove past the mall. The glass facade reflected the last light of day, cold and impersonal. For a brief moment, she parked her car and sat watching it, not out of hatred, but reflection. She thought of every woman, every man who had faced humiliation and had no voice to fight back. She thought of her younger self, the one who had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. The slap wasn't just his hand, it was a symbol of every time the world had tried to tell her she didn't belong. Now she understood her purpose more clearly than ever. The calm she maintained wasn't peace, it was preparation. The silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And when she finally chose to break it, the world would listen. As the lights of the mall flickered on, she started her car again. The road ahead shimmered with the faint reflection of city lights. She knew what tomorrow would bring. She knew who she was dealing with, and she knew that the reckoning had only just begun. By the time the mall closed that night, rumors had already reached the staff. The woman from the incident, the one Tom had disrespected, was scheduled to meet the corporation's leadership in person. Chapter 3. The Meeting. Morning sunlight washed over the skyline like liquid gold. Inside the headquarters of one of the largest retail conglomerates in the country, everything seemed pristine. Polished glass walls, silent elevators, and the low hum of wealth disguised as normalcy. But beneath that surface calm, something had shifted. The air carried tension, as if every wall, every floorboard knew that today would not be ordinary. The boardroom on the 32nd floor was prepared hours before the meeting. A long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting. Bottled water, neatly folded documents, and the faint aroma of imported coffee filled the air. Every executive in that room felt it, a quiet dread of what was coming. They knew the story by now. They had seen the footage, and they knew who was walking through their doors that morning. At precisely 9 o'clock, the elevator doors slid open. The sound of heels clicking against marble echoed through the corridor. Every step was deliberate, steady, confident. Alicia Monroe walked in, not as a victim, not as someone seeking apology, but as a woman who owned the room before she even entered it. Her presence silenced the murmurs instantly. The executives straightened in their seats. Her name carried weight, but it was her composure that commanded respect. She wore a white suit, pristine and powerful, a color of peace, but also of judgment. Behind her calm eyes, there was steel. The CEO of the mall's parent company, a man named Richard Dale, rose to greet her. His voice was polite, almost rehearsed. The atmosphere was one of damage control, a desperate attempt to contain what had already unraveled. Apologies were offered, legal phrases were used, policies were quoted, but none of it could erase the reality captured in that brief, haunting video clip, a mall manager striking a woman who had done nothing wrong. Alicia listened in silence. Every word, every excuse, every attempt to reframe the event. The room filled with voices speaking of reputation, of liability, of miscommunication. No one mentioned what it truly was, respect, born from prejudice. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her silence made them nervous. They filled the air with words because they couldn't stand the weight of what she represented, truth reflected back at them without flinching. When the last voice faded, Alicia finally leaned forward. Her gaze swept across the room. The executives shifted uneasily in their seats. There was something in her eyes, not anger, but purpose, a look that said she wasn't here for pity or revenge. She was here to make a point that would never be forgotten. She spoke softly, her voice measured, her tone unwavering. Every word cut through the air with the precision of a blade. She didn't demand retribution. She didn't need to. Instead, she talked about accountability, integrity, and the illusion of equality. She reminded them that companies weren't judged by their profits, but by how they treated those who could do nothing for them.
It wasn't more than business. It was transformation. The executives exchanged glances. They understood what this meant. Refusing the proposal would risk public exposure and destroy the deal. Accepting it would mean change, uncomfortable, overdue change. They knew which option they had. Alicia stood, thanked them for their time, and left the boardroom as calmly as she had entered. Her heels echoed down the corridor once more, the sound of control reclaimed. She didn't look back. Outside the building, a cool breeze brushed her face. The morning air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. She paused for a moment, staring at the horizon where sunlight cut through glass towers. It wasn't victory she felt, it was clarity. Some battles weren't about revenge. They were about rewriting what people believed was acceptable. Meanwhile, word of the meeting spread through the corporate grapevine faster than any press release. Executives whispered, PR teams prepared for possible leaks, and inside the mall, the staff began to sense that the world outside their walls had shifted. That afternoon, Tom Sanders received the email he had been dreading. It was brief,
a formal termination notice citing gross misconduct and violation of company ethics policy. He sat in his office, the walls closing in, staring at the words on his screen. The silence was suffocating. For the first time in years, he realized that his authority had never been power. It had only been permission, and that permission was gone. He gathered his things quietly, trying to ignore the stares of employees as he walked through the corridors one last time. No one spoke to him. No one offered comfort. The same mall that had once fed his arrogance now watched him leave in disgrace. As he passed the boutique, the same clerk who had whispered judgment at Alicia turned her face away, ashamed. Outside, the sky had darkened with the first hints of evening rain. He looked back at the building, the bright logos, the automatic doors, the clean, smiling advertisements. All of it looked artificial now. For the first time, he saw what Alicia must have seen. A place built on politeness, but rooted in hypocrisy. He walked away, his reflection fading into the glass behind him. Across the city, Alicia sat in her office, her hands folded, her expression serene. Her assistant entered with a tablet showing headlines. Quiet ones, not yet viral, but beginning to spread. Corporate investigation underway after mall incident. CEO Alicia Monroe leads cultural reform talks. The truth was leaking slowly, carefully, just as she wanted. The world was beginning to pay attention, not to a slap, but to what it represented. As the rain began to fall, Alicia turned her chair toward the window. Drops streaked down the glass, blurring the city lights below. In the reflection, she saw not just herself, but the countless others who had endured moments like hers in silence. For them, she would not remain quiet. There was still more to do. The next step would not be in a boardroom, but in the public eye. A story this deep, this revealing, could not remain confined to corporate corridors. It needed to be seen, heard, and remembered. Alicia knew the world loved stories, and this one she would tell her way.
Chapter 4. The Exposure. Days passed, but the air in the city felt different, heavier, more electric. The story that had begun inside a quiet boutique was now rippling beyond the walls of that mall. It spread not with noise, but through whispers, screenshots, and small acts of curiosity that built into waves. By the time the fourth day arrived, the entire corporate network was vibrating with the same question. Who was the woman? And soon, everyone knew. The footage leaked, not officially, not through news outlets, but through a single anonymous post. A short, grainy clip showing a mall manager striking a well-dressed woman who refused to be demeaned. The sound of that single slap was enough to ignite outrage. It was reposted, reshared, dissected. In less than 24 hours, it was everywhere. Online, faces that had once been ignored became avatars of justice. People watched, rewatched, and reacted with fury and disbelief. Hashtags multiplied, voices united, and strangers across the country demanded accountability. But the true shock came when someone connected the dots. The woman in the video wasn't just a shopper. She was Alicia Monroe, the CEO of Monroe Technologies, one of the most respected business leaders in the country. The revelation hit like lightning. The same world that had doubted her right to stand in a boutique now stood behind her. Every network picked up the story. Every news anchor repeated her name. The narrative shifted from scandal to symbol. It wasn't just about a slap. It was about power, prejudice, and the illusion of equality. Inside institutions that preached inclusion but practiced discrimination. Meanwhile, in the mall,
Fear replaced arrogance. Executives scrambled to manage the fallout, releasing statements filled with polished regret. We do not tolerate discrimination. We value diversity. We are reviewing our policies. Words carefully arranged by legal teams, devoid of emotion, detached from the rawness of what had actually happened. But the people weren't moved by press releases anymore. They wanted truth. They wanted justice. And most of all, they wanted to see accountability that couldn't be bought or hidden behind corporate polish. In her office, Alicia watched it all unfold from a distance. Screens around her glowed with headlines, debates, and think pieces analyzing every angle of her story. Yet she remained silent, letting the truth travel without her interference. Her silence had become its own statement, deliberate, dignified, powerful. The world spoke for her now. Behind that calm exterior, her mind worked with precision. Every reaction, every headline, every statement from the company's leadership was exactly what she had anticipated. She didn't need to push the narrative. She had already set it in motion. Her control wasn't in her words. It was in her restraint. Across town, the mall's corporate headquarters was in chaos. Stock values trembled. Board members panicked. Meetings were held late into the night. What began as a public relations issue had become a moral crisis. Investors threatened to withdraw. Activists called for boycotts. Employees began speaking up about their own experiences. Small stories of microaggressions, ignored complaints, and silent tolerance of bias that had built over years.
The public began to notice. Commentators shifted focus from outrage to admiration. They called her measured, brilliant, unshakable. She became a symbol of composure under fire, a lesson in grace and power. Her silence wasn't absence, it was dominance. It showed that true power didn't need to scream, it only needed to be seen. Meanwhile, Tom Sanders had vanished from public sight. His name trended briefly, attached to shame and condemnation. His face appeared in screenshots and news reports, always accompanied by the same haunting phrase, "The man who slapped a CEO." Friends avoided him, colleagues cut ties. The world he once ruled over with arrogance had turned its back completely. He stayed inside his small apartment for days, blinds drawn, the glow of his phone screen reflecting his downfall. Each message, each notification felt like a new strike against him. He watched as Alicia's name rose higher with every passing hour, not as a victim, but as a force that reshaped the narrative entirely. He had underestimated her, not just as a woman, not just as a professional, but as a person who refused to be defined by the limits others set for her. The media storm intensified. News outlets compared the incident to a mirror reflecting systemic bias in corporate America. Documentaries began planning segments. Talk shows invited analysts and social justice leaders to discuss the Monroe case. The footage had become more than an incident. It was now a case study, a reckoning. Through all of this, Alicia maintained her quiet strength. Her staff, once nervous about the exposure, began to move with newfound confidence, inspired by her calm. She reminded them, not with speeches, but with action, that dignity was the loudest form of resistance. She didn't respond to interviews. She didn't appear in press conferences. She focused instead on implementation, setting in motion reforms that would reach far beyond a single mall or a single company. But even as progress unfolded, Alicia knew this was only one layer of a larger fight. The story had awakened something, not just in her, but in countless others. People began to share their own stories online, each one echoing her experience in different ways. Retail workers, executives, students,
all finding their voices in the wake of her silence. It was never about revenge anymore. It was about awakening. The corporation, sensing the inevitable shift, embraced her proposals publicly. They presented them as collaborative reforms, pretending they were born out of goodwill rather than pressure. But Alicia didn't mind. The result mattered more than the credit. The transformation was happening, and that was enough. The mall that once treated her with suspicion now displayed banners promoting inclusivity. Training programs were launched, scholarships were announced. The very ground that had humiliated her had been forced to rebuild itself in her image. And still, she said nothing. Because sometimes, silence speaks louder than apology. As the weeks passed, Alicia's influence continued to grow. Her company's stock surged. Her reputation solidified as one of integrity and vision. She received messages of support from around the world, leaders, entrepreneurs, everyday people who saw in her the embodiment of resilience and grace. But late at night, when the lights in her office dimmed and the city quieted, she still thought about that moment, that single, stinging sound that had started it all. It wasn't the pain she remembered. It was the awakening it caused. That sound had been the echo of a system collapsing. And from its silence, something new had begun to rise.
Storytelling. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The world had changed in just a few weeks, though few had realized how permanent that change would be. The mall incident was no longer a headline. It had become a benchmark, a symbol replayed in conferences, classrooms, and boardrooms. Executives quoted it in training sessions. Professors dissected it in business ethics lectures. Even as the outrage began to fade, its echoes remained, reshaping conversations in quiet but lasting ways. For Alicia, the noise of the world had grown distant. She moved through her days with deliberate calm, focused not on the storm, but on what it had cleared away. Her team at Monroe Technologies had expanded the initiative she'd started, a reform program now adopted by several major corporations. The once private proposal had become a public model for inclusive leadership. Everywhere she went, people looked at her differently. Some saw a symbol of justice, others an untouchable icon of corporate power. But she never saw herself that way. To her, it was all simple. One person had used cruelty to remind her of how fragile respect could be, and she had answered not with fury, but with structure. Order had always been her weapon, discipline her armor. Yet even with progress in motion, there remained an unease inside her, a quiet tension that came from knowing true change rarely arrived without resistance. For every policy approved, there were voices in dark rooms questioning her motives. There were whispers that she had used the incident to advance her influence, that she had manipulated the narrative for gain. The same society that praised her power also feared it, and fear, she knew, had its own way of striking back. It began subtly. An editorial questioning her leadership appeared online, careful, polished, couched in corporate jargon, but dripping with resentment. Then came another, then a rumor about internal company politics. Anonymous sources claimed she was difficult, intimidating, uncompromising. The same qualities that had once earned her admiration were now being reframed as threats. But Alicia had lived long enough to recognize this pattern. It was the cycle every powerful woman faced: adoration followed by scrutiny, respect shadowed by resentment. She read every article, every post, and felt no anger. The storm was predictable, and she was already standing above it. The real reckoning, she realized, wasn't the world's judgment of her. It was the reflection she forced others to see, of their own biases, their own discomfort with equality that wasn't performative, but real. Across the city, the mall was almost unrecognizable. Its glossy ads now showcased diversity in every frame, its training sessions mandatory, its leadership structure rebuilt. Yet behind closed doors, some of its senior staff still resented what they called the Alicia effect. They missed the comfort of pretending things were fine. Accountability, after all, was heavier than ignorance. Tom Sanders remained a ghost in all of this, absent but never forgotten. The corporation had released an official statement about his termination, carefully worded and distant. His name was not mentioned again, at least not publicly. But in quiet corners of the internet, his story was discussed, dissected, and remembered as a cautionary tale. His fall had become a lesson for others in positions of power who mistook their authority for immunity. Alicia didn't think of him often. When she did, it wasn't with vengeance, but with reflection. She didn't believe in ruining lives. She believed in revealing truths. He had destroyed his own image the moment he let prejudice guide his actions. She had simply held up the mirror.
As weeks turned into months, Monroe Technologies hosted its first corporate ethics summit, a gathering of CEOs, policymakers, and social advocates. It was more than a conference. It was a declaration. The event was held in the same city where the incident had taken place, only a few miles from that very mall. Thousands attended. Cameras flashed, journalists filled the aisles, and the energy in the room felt like the cusp of something transformative. Alicia took the stage last. Her steps were calm, her expression unreadable. The crowd fell silent as she approached the podium. She looked out at them, rows of leaders, each representing an empire of their own. And she spoke about the invisible hierarchies that still lingered behind every smile, every handshake, every polished statement of equality. She spoke of how systems didn't change because of words, but because of will, of how accountability wasn't punishment, but progress. She reminded them that empathy without structure was decoration, and power without ethics was decay. Her words were quiet, but they carried a weight that filled the room. When she finished, there was no applause at first, only silence. The kind of silence that meant people were listening not to respond, but to understand. Then came the standing ovation, slow, deliberate, rising like a tide. The speech spread across the internet within hours. Clips of her words flooded social media. Conferences quoted her lines, and for the first time, corporations began competing not for profits, but for integrity. The reckoning had become cultural, but not everyone celebrated. Some saw it as a threat, an exposure of long-standing structures of control. Private networks whispered of resistance. Anonymous executives plotted ways to reframe her influence. They believed no one should have that much moral authority over an entire industry. But Alicia had anticipated this too. For every whisper of opposition, she had already built alliances, forged partnerships, and empowered voices that could continue the work without her. She understood that true leadership wasn't about permanence, it was about legacy. By the end of the summit, Monroe Technologies announced a nationwide mentorship program for women and minorities entering corporate management. It was bold, ambitious, and expensive. But it wasn't charity. It was balance, a shift of opportunity into hands long denied it. Alicia stood at the back of the stage after the event, watching the crowd disperse. The applause still echoed faintly, but she didn't smile. She felt no triumph, only peace, the kind that came from knowing the reckoning she had started would continue long after the noise faded. Outside, as dusk settled over the city, the streets shimmered with light. Billboards displayed her company's logo alongside a simple slogan, "Integrity builds empires." The campaign wasn't about branding, it was about philosophy. And everywhere it appeared, people saw a reminder of what had begun as an act of disrespect and what it had now become. In another part of the city, Tom Sanders sat in a small cafe, watching the news coverage play silently on the mounted television. He saw her face, her calm, commanding presence, her name beneath the headline, Alicia Monroe, Redefining Power. There was no bitterness left in him, only emptiness. The world had moved on, but he remained where he had fallen. For the first time, he understood the true cost of arrogance. As the night deepened, Alicia stood once more by her office window, the skyline stretching endlessly before her. The city had changed, the industry had changed, and perhaps in small ways, even the hearts of those who once doubted her had shifted too. The reckoning was not about punishment, it was about awakening, and awakenings once begun could not be undone. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the pulse of the world outside, a world she had reshaped not with vengeance, but with vision.
Storytelling. Chapter 6. The Reflection. The noise of the world had begun to fade, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. The silence that follows after a storm, when all that remains is reflection. For Alicia Monroe, the months that followed the summit were not filled with celebration, but with distance. She attended fewer meetings, spent more time in her office, and often sat by the tall window that overlooked the city she had once fought to conquer. The same skyline that had once represented ambition now looked different, calmer, almost fragile. She had won, the world said. But victories, she had learned, often carried invisible scars. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. In airports, boardrooms, restaurants, eyes followed her, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with envy. Her name had become a symbol, her image a brand of strength. But beneath all the titles and recognition, there remained a question she couldn't escape. Who had she become through all this? She had started this journey as a woman simply living her life, unseen by most, defined by none. But after that day in the mall, everything had shifted. She had been forced into the light, into a role she never sought, the role of a reminder. To some, she was proof that power could belong to anyone. To others, a disruption of the order they depended on. She had taken that unwanted attention and turned it into something greater: justice, awareness, reform. But in the quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the applause faded, she often wondered what it had cost her to stay composed, to stay untouchable. Her reflection in the window became a familiar stranger, elegant, calm, distant, the kind of person people respected but no longer approached. She had built an empire around strength, but somewhere in that fortress, softness had been left behind. It was on one of those evenings, with rain tracing lines down the glass, that she found herself thinking about her mother, a woman who once cleaned offices like this one, who had raised her to believe that dignity had nothing to do with wealth or titles. Her mother had taught her how to rise without losing herself, But standing there now, Alicia wasn't sure she had kept that promise. Power, she realized, demanded sacrifices that kindness could not always afford. She had learned to wear restraint as armor, to respond to injustice with strategy, never emotion. It had kept her safe, but it had also made her distant. The more she had climbed, the more she had left parts of herself behind. Her assistant, a young woman named Brianna, often reminded her of who she once was, ambitious, bright-eyed, full of faith in the system's fairness. Alicia watched her sometimes, speaking to teams, making suggestions, unaware of the subtle walls that would soon rise around her as she advanced. Walls of perception, bias, expectation. Alicia wanted to protect her, but she knew that growth required storms. She couldn't shelter anyone from the reality she had lived through. All she could do was make the world less cruel when they faced it. That thought became the foundation for something new, something quieter but deeper than any corporate initiative. She began building what she called the Glass Project, a mentorship network that would connect women from marginalized backgrounds to leaders in business, law, and technology. It wasn't about publicity, it was about legacy. She spent nights drafting its framework, reaching out personally to partners who understood its purpose. For the first time in months, she felt purpose that wasn't about defense, but about creation. The project grew quickly, not because of her fame, but because it carried truth. It became a movement rooted in empathy rather than ambition.
Chapter 7. The Redemption. The morning sunlight crept softly through the blinds, scattering golden lines across Alicia Monroe's desk. It had been a quiet night. Too quiet, in fact. The city outside had begun to hum with its usual rhythm, but inside her office, the silence felt unusually heavy. Her phone vibrated once, breaking that calm. A new message appeared. It was from an unknown number. Just 3 words. I need help. For a moment she hesitated. She received messages every day, requests, appeals, even confessions. But something about this one stopped her. She stared at it, her intuition whispering that this was different. Against her usual caution, she replied with a simple, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "It's Tom." Her breath caught. It had been nearly a year since she'd last heard his name. The man whose arrogance had started it all. The man whose downfall had echoed through every screen, every story, every conversation about power and prejudice. The mall manager who had struck her that day, and in doing so, had struck the world awake. She sat back in her chair, eyes narrowing as she read the name again. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her instincts warned her to ignore it, to delete the message and move on. But something deeper, something human, urged her to respond. And so she did. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. His message was brief, hesitant, and trembling between shame and desperation. He had lost everything: his job, his marriage, his sense of self. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was looking for a way to live again. Alicia read his words carefully, and beneath the regret, she saw truth. Not manipulation, not performance, but the kind of humility that only comes after the world has stripped a person bare. It would have been easy to ignore him, easy to remind herself that he had created his own ruin.